told the story in whispers, not in books, not in sermons, not in history lessons. It wasn't meant for you to know, and that is exactly why you must hear it, because in the suffocating heat of a Mississippi summer in 1851, inside a mansion built on bones and blood, 15 of the state's most powerful men and women raised their glasses to prosperity and swallowed death instead. The poison wasn't just in their wine. It was in the soil, in the walls, in the very system that had made them rich and untouchable. And the hand that delivered it belonged to a woman who had been silenced her entire life, a woman the records only dared to call Celia. Understand this. What happened at Willowbrook Plantation wasn't just a crime. It was an act of forbidden knowledge made flesh. A carefully calculated ritual of vengeance that exposed the hidden rot beneath the shining facade of Southern power. And when those 15 bodies dropped to the floor, convulsing, choking, clutching at their throats, it wasn't just death, it was revelation. It was history tearing off its mask and showing you the skull beneath. But before you hear how the poison spread, you must understand the stage upon which this performance of terror was played. Willowbrook wasn't just a plantation. It was a laboratory of cruelty, an institution where brutality became ceremony. The man at its center, Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford, was not content with the casual savagery of his peers. He was an innovator in domination. He called it creative correction, a philosophy that turned suffering into entertainment. Judges, politicians, planters, and their perfumed wives would gather in a pavilion built for spectacle, sipping wine as enslaved men and women screamed for mercy. Rutherford believed punishment meant nothing unless it was witnessed, unless it became a show that imprinted fear not only on the body being broken, but on every set of eyes forced to watch. And through it all, Celia was there, in the kitchen, stirring pots, grinding herbs, seasoning roasts. She was the unseen architect of every feast that accompanied every act of orchestrated cruelty. She could hear the lash cutting through flesh while she carved meat. She could hear children begging for their mothers while she kneaded bread, the laughter of Mississippi's elite, the clinking of silver goblets, the sound of her master's voice praising discipline. These were the background music of her daily existence. For 18 years she endured this. 18 years of cooking meals for men who used her children as props in their theater of control. 18 years of silence while her first daughter was sold away, her first son executed for stealing bread, her second daughter buried in the cold earth after pneumonia tore through her lungs. Only one child remained, Marcus, 7 years old, too young to understand the true weight of what Rutherford had planned for him. Too young to know he had been chosen as the demonstration for the grandest feast Mississippi had ever seen. This is the detail the official records hid, the piece they scrubbed from polite Southern memory. On July 12, 1851, Marcus, the last child Celia had left, was to be tortured before the same guests who would later choke on her cornbread. The boy's suffering would have been the climax of Rutherford's philosophy, the ultimate correction for the anniversary of his empire. But Celia heard the whispers. She knew before the announcement was made, and in that moment, she ceased to be a servant. She became something far more dangerous. For 30 days she prepared not just food but destiny. She walked the fields at dawn, gathering plants that most would mistake for weeds, but her grandmother had taught her to recognize as weapons. Hemlock, oleander, pokeweed. She dried too. Hem in shadows, ground them in silence, and planned her masterpiece with the patience of a general. Each ingredient chosen for its timing, each dish calibrated for effect. Wine for convulsions, bread for bleeding, dessert for the final blow. When the guests sat down to dine that July evening, they believed they were celebrating 25 years of wealth, power, and progress. What they were actually witnessing was the unveiling of forbidden justice, a last supper carved not for the enslaved, but for the masters themselves. And by the time the candles burned low, Celia had proven what every empire built on cruelty eventually learns. Fear is fragile, and power can be poisoned. To understand Celia's vengeance, you must first understand the world that created her. Because Willowbrook was not simply a plantation, it was a theater of control, a stage where power was rehearsed and perfected until it became ritual. The White Mansion stood like a temple of false civilization, its pillars gleaming under the Mississippi sun, a monument to wealth carved from blood. But beneath its polished facade lay something far darker, a machine designed to grind human beings into silence and to teach everyone present, enslaved and free, that the Colonel's will was law. Jeremiah Rutherford was no ordinary planter. He was obsessed with the science of fear. Where others used random lashings and brute cruelty, Rutherford demanded structure, ceremony, performance. His punishments were not secret. They were orchestrated. His pavilion, a grotesque amphitheater built just behind the mansion, was designed to turn suffering into entertainment. Wooden benches lined the edges, oil lamps hung in careful rows to illuminate every scream, every trembling body, every scar carved into flesh. There, judges debated law while watching men whipped until their skin opened. Politicians laughed over cigars as women were humiliated before the crowd. Wealthy planters brought their children to learn what Rutherford called the art of discipline. This was no accident, it was social engineering. Rutherford believed terror was most effective when shared, when it spread like a contagion. He wrote in his letters, a few of which survived hidden in courthouse basements, that discipline must be witnessed, absorbed, and remembered. To him, cruelty was not just control, it was pedagogy, a lesson, a curriculum of violence meant to teach both enslaved and elite their place in the grand hierarchy of power. And in this twisted university of terror, Celia was forced to serve as silent accomplice. Every feast she cooked was a mask for horror. The guests dined on roasted duck and turtle soup while a child was beaten bloody yards away. Sweet cobblers and sugared wines were served while men were strung from posts, their bodies breaking under the whip. Celia's kitchen faced the pavilion. Every dish she stirred was infused with the sound of agony, every spice sprinkled against the backdrop of begging voices. She did not just cook meals, she cooked through screams. For nearly 2 decades she lived inside that contradiction, the creator of nourishment forced to feed the destroyers of life. Think of the psychology of it. Every bite her masters savored was proof of her skill, every compliment on her seasoning an acknowledgement of her worth, and yet her worth was chained, branded, and bought. They applauded her meals even as they prepared to take her last child. They praised her cornbread while planning the lesson that would make Marcus bleed before their eyes. It was here that the seed of vengeance germinated, because when a woman is forced to watch her children broken, when her skill becomes the instrument of her torment, the line between servant and executioner begins to blur. Rutherford believed he had built a system without cracks. He kept ledgers like Holy Scripture, cotton yields, punishments admin, stirred, deaths recorded with the same cold precision as crop weights. To him, suffering was a number. To his overseers, pain was an entry in a book. Samuel, 14 years old, died of correction, cost $250 for burial. This was the language of the institution. Lives converted to figures, children reduced to expense lines. It was the accounting of evil disguised as management. But what the Colonel could not measure, could not record, could not reduce to numbers, was the slow accumulation of memory. Memory does not vanish. It lingers. It festers. Celia remembered the night her daughter was sold away, the smell of her son's blood on the dirt, the sight of her baby girl coughing herself to death in the freezing quarters. These were not numbers. These were ghosts, and they haunted her kitchen every day she lit the fire. By the spring of 1851, when Rutherford announced his grand 25th anniversary feast, those ghosts had hardened into resolve. He planned to showcase his ultimate correction, a new level of performance that would immortalize his philosophy. And the chosen subject was Marcus, Celia's boy. But while Rutherford sharpened his knives of spectacle, Celia sharpened something older, something more dangerous, the forbidden knowledge her grandmother had whispered into her as a child, the secrets of roots, leaves, and seeds, the hidden power of plants, remedies that could heal or kill, knowledge that survived chains because it lived in memory, carried in stories, encoded in survival. This was the crack in Rutherford's machine. The arrogance of believing cruelty was infinite, that knowledge belonged only to him. He could measure cotton. He could choreograph pain, but he could not see what was growing in the margins, in the silence, in the woman bent over her cooking pots. He could not imagine that the same hands that prepared his feast would also prepare his ending, and that is why history sealed the records, because the story of Celia's Last Supper is not just about one act of poison. It is about the collapse of an illusion, that control is absolute, that fear is eternal, that the oppressed cannot turn knowledge into fire. The truth, the one they never wanted you to know, is this: every empire of cruelty carries within it the recipe for its own destruction. The first rule of vengeance is patience, and patience was the one thing Willowbrook had drilled into Celia until it was etched into her bones. For nearly 2 decades she had endured humiliation, silence, loss. But now, with the threat of Marcus's blood about to stain the pavilion floor, patience transformed into calculation. Her kitchen became her sanctuary, her forge, her battlefield. Every shelf of dried herbs, every root in the cellar, every leaf growing in the shadows outside. Suddenly, these were not ingredients for nourishment. They were weapons waiting to be summoned. At dawn, while the other enslaved workers still stirred in their quarters, Celia slipped out under the veil of dew. She did not walk the cotton fields where overseers' eyes kept watch. She went to the marshes, to the hidden gullies where the soil was soft and the plants grew in secret. This was forbidden land, not because it was owned by Rutherford, but because it was owned by knowledge. The same knowledge her grandmother had whispered into her ears when she was a child newly purchased, still remembering fragments of stories from the old world. This root will heal, this berry will kill, this leaf, when dried, becomes a knife sharper than steel. She remembered those lessons now, and she harvested with precision. Water hemlock, its roots fat and pale beneath the mud, holding cicutoxin potent enough to convulse a grown man to death in an hour. Oleander, deceptively beautiful, its flowers and leaves containing the power to stop a heart cold. Pokeweed, its blackberries dangling like jewels, but inside their skin lay saponins that could bleed a body from within. And castor beans scattered along the fence lines carrying ricin, invisible, merciless. Each plant was dangerous, yes, but combined, layered, orchestrated, they became unstoppable. Celia was not planning a single strike. She was composing a symphony of death. She dried roots in silence, ground leaves to dust in corners no one entered, boiled extracts under the guise of soup preparation. She understood what her master never could: that true knowledge is not written in ledgers or paraded in letters. It is carried in whispers, in the hands of women who cook and clean and survive unnoticed. The risk was enormous. One slip of the hand, one wrong dosage, and she would collapse in her own kitchen before the feast. Poison is not just chemistry, it is strategy. Too much, and suspicion falls immediately on the cook. Too little, and the guests survive, pointing their trembling fingers at the woman who had served them. Celia knew she had one chance, and it had to be perfect. And so she rehearsed, not openly, but in shadows. She sprinkled trace amounts of extracts into her own food, testing her body's reaction, measuring bitterness, adjusting quantities. She knew the timing of symptoms, how long until a stomach churned, how long until hands began to tremble, how long until speech slurred and skin broke out in sweat. She became both scientist and soldier, calibrating death with the same precision Rutherford used to weigh cotton. But where he measured profit, she measured justice. Meanwhile, Willowbrook bustled with preparation for the anniversary feast. New uniforms for servants, fresh paint on the mansion walls, imported wine from Charleston, a string quartet commissioned from Jackson. Rutherford's arrogance was on full display. He was staging his triumph, blind to the storm brewing in his own kitchen. He ordered Celia to prepare the grandest menu she had ever constructed: turtle soup, venison with bourbon glaze, roasted duck, sweet potatoes, cornbread, cobblers, custard, hors brandied fruits, a parade of indulgence. And Celia smiled, nodded, and bowed her head, all while deciding exactly which dish would carry which poison. The cornbread, safe, familiar, eaten by all, would carry pokeweed. The wine, always poured generously and consumed quickly, would carry hemlock extract. The dessert, that final indulgence, would carry oleander. each layer timed so that as the guests laughed and debated politics, the first symptoms would creep in like invisible fingers tightening around their throats. By the time they realized something was wrong, the feast would already be inside them, irreversible, inescapable, and through it all, Celia remained silent. She did not confide in the other enslaved workers. She did not whisper her plan even to Marcus. Silence was survival. Secrecy was her only ally. Because if even a single word slipped into the wrong ear, her son would not live long enough to see the feast begin. But silence did not mean solitude. There was something else in the kitchen with her, something that had always been there, the weight of memory. Her grandmother's voice, her children's faces, the screams from the pavilion echoing against the stone walls. These were her companions, these were her allies, and as she prepared each vial, each powder, each deadly mixture, she was no longer just a cook. She was an executioner cloaked in humility. Rutherford thought the feast would demonstrate his power, his mastery, his philosophy of fear, but what he had truly built was his own coffin. Because every empire of control carries a flaw, a blind spot. His was Celia, invisible, silent, dismissed, and in that invisibility lay her weapon. The night of July 12th approached. Guests prepared their finest clothes. Carriages gleamed, music sheets were rehearsed, and in the heart of the kitchen, a woman sharpened her silence into a blade. The feast would not be a keen celebration. It would be an ending. July 12, 1851, dawned like any other summer morning in Mississippi, hot, heavy, and merciless. By noon, the air was a wet blanket that clung to skin and slowed breath, the kind of heat that made even time itself seem to stagger. But inside Willowbrook Plantation, the atmosphere was not sluggish. It was electric. Servants rushed with polished silver and linens. Overseers barked orders to ensure carriages would be received in grandeur. And at the center of it all, Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford strutted in his white linen suit, a man preparing not for dinner, but for coronation. This was his empire's triumph. 25 years of cotton wealth, of political influence, of cruelty disguised as enlightenment, condensed into one night. The guest list glittered with names that ruled Mississippi like minor gods: judges, senators, plantation lords, families who had never known hunger, who believed themselves born to command. They came not just to eat, but to confirm their place in a hierarchy they thought eternal. And Celia watched them arrive from the narrow window of her kitchen. The first carriage clattered down the drive, 4 horses pulling Senator Augustus Pembroke, his wife, and their 3 grown children. Their clothing shimmered with imported fabrics. Their laughter floated through the sticky air like a mockery. Behind them came Judge Thaddeus Claiborne, his carriage marked with the seal of the Mississippi Circuit Court. His wife descended gracefully, the same woman who had once clapped during a whipping demonstration. Their children followed, daughters in pale dresses, a son wearing the smugness of a boy raised to inherit power. One by one they arrived. Colonel Robert Fleming of Hinds County, a man who boasted of breaking more men than he owned. The Havenshire brothers from Madison, who measured their prosperity not just in cotton bales but in broken backs. And finally, Mrs. Cordelia Van Cleve, the widow planter who owned more slaves than any living man in Warren C. County. Her arrival was accompanied by the ringing of harness bells, a sound Rutherford had insisted upon for pomp. The courtyard of Willowbrook transformed into a theater of excess. Gentlemen smoked cigars and spoke of northern abolitionists as though they were pests. Ladies sipped chilled tea, fanning themselves while mocking the enslaved who hurried past with trays. Carriages gleamed in the sun, horses snorted, laughter rolled across the veranda. To the casual eye, this was civilization at its peak. Order, wealth, refinement. But to Celia, watching from the shadow of her kitchen, it was something else entirely. It was a gathering of executioners in their Sunday best. The very people who had applauded when her son was threatened, when her neighbors were broken, when the pavilion filled with screams, and tonight every one of them would dine at her table. By mid-afternoon, Rutherford addressed his guests from the grand porch, bourbon in hand. He spoke of Willowbrook's legacy, of his philosophy of discipline, of the glory of Mississippi agriculture. His words oozed confidence, as if he believed history itself bent to his will. Tonight, he declared, you shall see a demonstration of correction so absolute, so final, that none shall doubt the strength of our institution. The guests applauded, clapping with rings on their fingers, sweat glistening on their brows. Not one of them suspected that their applause was already a funeral hymn. Inside, Celia prepared the meal with a calm that bordered on supernatural. Her face betrayed nothing. Her hands moved with precision born of years spent in servitude. She stirred the turtle soup, thick with herbs. She basted the venison with bourbon glaze. She folded cornbread batter with deliberate care, slipping into it the powder that would soon unravel intestines and stain linen dresses red from within. In the decanter of red wine, lighted hemlock, its bitterness masked by the grape's richness, and in the peach cobbler, golden and fragrant, rested the sweetness of oleander. Every dish was more than food, it was a verdict. Every plate carried not just sustenance but sentence. She did not eat, she did not taste, she did not falter. The kitchen staff, oblivious, followed her instructions, slicing vegetables, polishing dishes, arranging flowers. To them, this was just another feast. To Celia, it was the culmination of 30 days of silence sharpened into justice. From the pavilion outside, Marcus's muffled cries still reached her ears. He had been locked away, prepared as the evening's lesson. The sound should have broken her, but instead it steeled her. Each whimper was a reminder of what was at stake, of why failure was not an option. At 6:30 sharp, Rutherford summoned the guests to the pavilion for his entertainment. Oil lamps were lit, the sun dipped behind cotton fields, and the stage of cruelty was prepared. The guests filed in with eager anticipation, their bellies primed for the feast to follow. None of them noticed Celia slipping quietly through the kitchen door, her face serene, her hands steady as she placed the final dishes on silver trays. The trap was set. The feast of vengeance was ready. By the time the first spoon touched lips, history would shift and power would choke on its own arrogance. The lamps in the pavilion burned like halos of fire as the crowd gathered, their shadows stretching across the dirt floor. This was the theatre of discipline, the grotesque cathedral where Rutherford played his sermons of cruelty. The air was thick with heat, sweat, and the stench of anticipation. Men loosened collars, women dabbed their foreheads with lace, but none left. They were here for the spectacle, the ritual humiliation that reminded them why they ruled and why others obeyed. At the center stood a wooden post, stained dark from years of punishment. Shackles glimmered in the lamplight. The overseer, Benjamin Harwick, rear, dyed his whip, thick, braided, oiled. His eyes darted to Rutherford for instruction, like a priest awaiting the signal to begin mass, and then, as if unveiling a prize, they brought out Marcus. He was 7 years old, barefoot, small enough that the shackles had to be adjusted to hold his wrists. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, but his eyes were not broken. They were terrified, yes, but alive, and that life was the threat. That spark of defiance, that refusal to submit, was what Rutherford wanted extinguished before his guests. He called it the ultimate correction. What it truly was a ritual sacrifice. The guests leaned forward. Laughter died down into hushed attention. Rutherford raised his hand, commanding silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice deep with pride, "tonight you will witness the very essence of discipline. A demonstration that will prove beyond doubt that our institution is not mere habit, but science. Observe, and you will see correction at its most absolute." Whispers of approval rippled through the crowd. The judges, the senators, the planters, they nodded like worshippers receiving doctrine. Some even clapped politely, as if this child's torment were just another toast. From the kitchen's shadowed doorway, Celia stood frozen. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms until she felt blood. She wanted to scream, to rush forward, to tear Marcus from their hands. But she didn't move. She couldn't. If she faltered now, all was lost. The poison was already moving, already weaving its invisible fingers through veins and stomachs. The first symptoms would arrive soon. All she had to do was wait. All she had to do was endure the unbearable a few moments longer. Harwick cracked the whip against the dirt, the sound splitting the night like thunder. Marcus flinched. The guests gasped with delight, some laughing, others nodding as though attending a lecture. Rutherford's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Begin," he ordered. But then something subtle shifted. Not in the pavilion's ritual, but in the bodies of the guests themselves. Senator Pembroke coughed, at first soft, then violent, wine sputtering from his lips. His wife reached to steady him, but her own hand trembled uncontrollably, knocking her fan to the ground. A Claiborne boy whispered to his sister that his stomach hurt, clutching himself with sudden panic. Judge Claiborne frowned, dabbing at sweat beading on his forehead, though the evening breeze had cooled the air. The first ripples of poison had begun, quiet, almost unnoticeable, but Celia saw it. She recognized the signs. The hemlock in the wine was doing its work, tightening muscles, burning nerves, unraveling the illusion of control sip by sip. Rutherford noticed nothing. He was too focused on his spectacle, too drunk on his own doctrine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, gesturing toward Marcus bound to the post, "behold the future secured by discipline." But discipline had already betrayed him. In the silence between whip cracks, the sound of labored breathing began to spread across the pavilion. Groans masked as coughs, fidgets disguised as shifting in seats, the beginnings of nausea curling inside stomachs. The poison was moving faster than gossip, crawling beneath silk dresses and linen coats, seizing organs before minds could catch up. Marcus looked up through the lamplight, his eyes locking on his mother's shadowed figure in the doorway. He did not know her plan. He could not. But in that glance, something passed between them, an unspoken promise. Tonight would not end the way Rutherford intended. To nigger. Hut. History would be written in blood, but not his. Celia held her silence like a blade. She had chosen this moment, this intersection of cruelty and arrogance, to strike. And as the whip rose once more, a second wave of poison hit the crowd like an unseen storm. A Havenshire brother lurched forward, retching onto the dirt. His companion staggered backward, clutching at his chest. Mrs. Van Cleve dropped her fan, eyes wide as her lips tinged blue. The murmurs turned to confusion, the confusion to alarm. Guests turned on each other with panicked whispers. "What is happening? Is it the heat? Is it the wine?" The feast had not yet even been served, but the first act of Celia's vengeance was already unfolding. The masters, the judges, the planters, the ones who thought themselves untouchable, were already falling under her invisible hand. And for the first time in Willowbrook's history, the pavilion echoed not with orchestrated screams of slaves, but with the unplanned suffering of masters. Celia exhaled. The trap had sprung, and the night was only beginning. The pavilion emptied in chaos. What was meant to be Rutherford's crowning performance had dissolved into uneasy murmurs, trembling hands, and pale faces. Servants rushed to escort the guests back inside, whispering that perhaps it was the heat, perhaps too much brandy, perhaps nothing at all. They avoided saying the one truth none of them dared consider, that they were already being undone from within. The dining hall was lit like a palace, chandeliers blazing with dozens of candles, polished silver glinting from every surface. Long tables groaned under the weight of Celia's work. Steaming bowls of turtle soup, platters of venison glistening with bourbon glaze, roasted duck, fried catfish, sweet potatoes, butter beans, cornbread stacked high in golden bricks. To any outsider, it would have seemed a triumph of southern hospitality. To those seated, it was a final sacrament. Rutherford raised his glass, his voice commanding, though his hand trembled almost imperceptibly. "Let us not allow this evening's little disturbances to shadow our celebration," he declared, forcing laughter from his guests. "Tonight we honor 25 years of order, prosperity, and enlightenment. Tonight, Willowbrook proves why our world endures." The guests raised their goblets, some reluctantly, others with forced smiles. Already, some clutched their stomachs beneath the table, others dabbed sweat from their brows. But the ritual of wealth demanded they play their part. And so they drank again, swallowing more of the hemlock they blamed on nothing more than wine's strength. Celia glided among them like a phantom. Her face calm, her hands steady. She set bowls of soup before judges, placed cornbread near senators, laid venison before planters. No one looked at her twice. No one suspected. She was invisible, as she had always been, But now invisibility was power. Every dish she set down was another nail in the coffin of an empire. The first course was taken eagerly. Guests slurped turtle soup, savoring its richness, its layered spices. None noticed the faint bitterness masked within. The cornbread was devoured, its familiar comfort hiding the powder of pokeweed ground so fine it left no trace. The venison, drenched in bourbon glaze, carried the earthiness of water hemlock beneath the sweetness of the liquor. Bite after bite, sip after sip, the poison spread. Then the symptoms began to mount. Judge Claiborne's eldest son dropped his spoon, clutching his stomach with a groan that silenced half the table. Mrs. Pembroke coughed violently into her napkin, leaving crimson stains she tried to hide. One of the Havenshire brothers staggered to his feet, muttered, airing that the room was spinning before collapsing back into his chair, face ashen, eyes rolling. Panic rippled like fire across linen. Guests whispered, then shouted. Wives fanned husbands. Husbands demanded water. Some accused the heat, others the wine, a few even the cooks. But Rutherford, blind with arrogance, slammed his fist on the table. Enough! This is nothing but indulgence and nerves. Sit down, compose yourselves. His words echoed, but his own face betrayed him. Pale, slick with sweat, jaw clenched against the nausea crawling inside him. Celia moved silently, collecting empty bowls, replacing goblets, her expression unreadable. But inside, she felt a storm. Not triumph yet. It was too early for triumph. She knew some would survive longer than others. That suspicion could still shift toward her, that Marcus's fate still hung in the balance. But as she looked at their faces, powerful men reduced to clutching their bellies, women gasping for breath, the once mighty trembling like children, she felt something she had not felt in years. Control. For once, she held the strings. The second course arrived. Roasted duck, venison, sweet potatoes, beans. The guests ate less eagerly now, suspicion lurking at the corners of their minds. Yet they still ate. Hunger, ritual, arrogance, they could not imagine refusing what was set before them. To refuse would be to admit weakness, to suggest they doubted the order of their world. And so they ate, sealing their fate with every reluctant bite. The symptoms intensified. One of Claiborne's daughters screamed as her father slumped forward into his soup, face submerged, arms twitching. The Havenshire brother, who had collapsed earlier, now convulsed violently, knocking plates and silverware to the ground. Mrs. Van Cleve gripped her chest, gasping as though an invisible hand was squeezing her heart. The dining hall dissolved into chaos. Chairs toppled, silver clattered, goblets shattered against the floor. Guests staggered to their feet, eyes wide with terror, calling for help, for doctors, for God. Their voices, once so confident, now cracked into shrieks and moans, and through it all, Rutherford remained at the head of the table, his pride battling his body. He tried to stand, to command order, but his legs betrayed him. His knees buckled, his hand gripped the edge of the table as his voice broke into a strangled cough. Blood flecked his lips. His empire was collapsing before him, and he could not stop it. Celia watched, silent, steady. Her heart pounded, but her face remained stone. She was the servant, the shadow, the unseen. But tonight, she was also judge, jury, and executioner. And as the hall filled with screams and the mighty fell to the ground, she knew the last supper of Willowbrook had begun. The dining hall no longer looked like a feast. It looked like a battlefield. The long mahogany table, polished for prestige, was overturned by convulsing bodies. Linen cloths, once starched and pressed, now soaked in wine, sweat, and vomit. Silver goblets rolled across the floor like fallen crowns. The chandeliers flickered, throwing shadows that danced like specters over a room of the dying. One by one, the guests lost their masks. Senator Pembroke, who had once the sardine, undered in the State House about slavery as divinely ordained, was now on his knees, clawing at his throat, his face purple with suffocation. His wife, who had once mocked the cries of a whipped child, now screamed for her own children as they collapsed beside her, foam streaking their lips. Judge Claiborne's daughters shrieked until their voices broke, their silken gowns smeared with the filth of their father's last breath. The Havenshire brothers, titans of cotton, grappled with each other in confusion, spitting accusations through bloody vomit. You brought this. No, you did. Until both fell twitching, their limbs striking the floor in grotesque rhythm. Mrs. Van Cleve, the richest widow in Warren County, staggered toward the door, pearls scattering from her broken necklace, only to collapse against the wall, her fingernails raking desperate trails into the wood before she slid lifeless to the floor. The air was thick with screams, the smell of bile, the metallic tang of blood. Yet amidst the chaos, one voice still tried to command order. Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford. He forced himself to stand at the head of the table, gripping the carved chair like a mast against the storm. His face was drenched in sweat, his breath ragged, but his pride, his delusion of control, refused to die as quickly as his body. "Silence," he roared, though his voice cracked. "Compose yourselves. This is nothing but—" His words faltered into a choking cough, blood splattering the linen. Still, he tried again. "You will not disgrace my house." But his empire was already crumbling around him. His overseer, Harwick, rushed to his side, eyes wide with terror. "It's poison, Colonel. They've been poisoned." His words ripped through the hall, igniting hysteria. All eyes turned, some to the plates, others to the wine, and then, inevitably, to the kitchen door. Accusations erupted, spit out through frothing lips. "The cook! The slave woman! She's done this!" Celia stood in that doorway, calm, still, her white apron stained from serving, her face expressionless. She did not speak. She did not run. She simply stood, as the most powerful men and women in Mississippi writhed before her. For nearly 2 decades they had not seen her. She had been invisible, a shadow moving between kitchens and tables. Now they saw her, and in that moment their fear doubled, because nothing terrifies the master more than the servant who no longer bows. Rutherford, gasping, pointed a trembling finger at her. His lips tried to form words, accusation, condemnation, but his throat seized, his jaw clenched, and he fell to his knees. The great colonel of Willowbrook, the man who had turned torture into entertainment, collapsed into the very feast he had demanded. Panic exploded. Guests who could still move staggered for the doors, tripping over bodies, clawing at each other. Some tried to vomit the poison back, forcing fingers down their throats until blood followed bile. Others begged the servants for help, the same servants they had beaten, whipped, sold. But the servants stood frozen, some in shock, others with a silent glimmer of something long buried. Satisfaction. The string quartet, hired from Jackson, dropped their instruments, rushing for the exits in terror. Horses outside neighed wildly, carriages rocked as drivers scrambled, sensing the madness within the house. The sound of splintering glass, crashing silver, and desperate cries filled the plantation. And through it all, Celia did not move. She watched, steady, unflinching, as her poisons claimed them one by one. She had no need for words. The silence of her presence was louder than any accusation. She was no longer their cook. She was their judge. By the end of that hour, the hall of Willowbrook resembled a mausoleum. 15 of Mississippi's most powerful lay twisted in death, lips blue, eyes glassy, bodies sprawled across fine Persian rugs. The empire that had stood on their shoulders had cracked in an instant, undone not by war, nor rebellion, nor politics, but by a woman they had owned, a woman they thought powerless, who had turned a feast into their execution. The Last Supper of Willowbrook was complete, and history, terrified of what it revealed, would try to bury it for generations. The screams did not stop all at once. They ebbed, staggered, until only moans and choking gasps remained. Then even those fell silent, leaving the great hall of Willowbrook in a hush more terrifying than noise. Chandeliers still burned, their light glinting on silver knives and overturned goblets, but the bodies below them lay motionless, tangled in grotesque positions of death. The air was heavy with sickness, the acrid tang of vomit, the sweetness of spilled wine, the copper of blood. It was no longer a feast. It was a tomb. The enslaved stood frozen at the edges of the room. They had been ordered to serve, to pour, to polish, but now their hands trembled at their sides. They dared not move, dared not breathe too loudly. For though the masters were dead, the institution was not. Overseers still stood armed. Eyes darted toward Celia. Suspicion mingled with something else. Fear. For the first time they looked at her not as property, not as a shadow, but as a force. Celia did not speak. She did not explain. She did not weep. She stood in her apron, her hands folded before her, her expression calm, as if she had merely completed the evening service. Yet within her, her heart thundered. Not with regret, not with triumph, with finality. For she knew that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Colonel Rutherford's body lay sprawled across the head of the table, his once pristine suit soaked through with blood and bile. His overseer, Benjamin Harwick, knelt beside him, shaking the limp shoulders, shouting his name as if pride alone could call him back from the grave. But the colonel did not rise. The master of Willowbrook, the self-proclaimed innovator of discipline, was nothing now but another corpse in the feast he demanded. "Poison!" Harwick muttered at last, his voice trembling with both rage and disbelief. His eyes swept the room, the dishes, the goblets, the bodies, and then landed on Celia. "It was her," he hissed. "It was the cook." The servants flinched. Some lowered their eyes. Others glanced at Celia with something like awe. For years she had been invisible. Tonight she was the storm that had torn down pillars. Harwick stood, pointing at her with a trembling hand. "Seize her!" he barked to the surviving overseers. "She's the one. She's killed them all." But none moved immediately. The men with whips and pistols hesitated. Perhaps it was fear of her, of what else she might have prepared. Perhaps it was something deeper, the unspoken recognition that they had just witnessed the unmasking of power's illusion. The masters they served lay dead at their feet, undone not by armies, not by courts, but by one enslaved woman who had known their weaknesses better than they knew themselves. The silence stretched. In that silence, Celia's figure grew larger than life. She was no longer just a cook. She was vengeance, ants embodied. At last, Harwick, trembling with fury, grabbed a pistol from his belt and leveled it at her chest. The enslaved gasped, some covering their mouths, others holding their breath. Celia did not flinch. Her eyes locked on Harwick's, unblinking, steady, as though daring him to pull the trigger. For the first time in his life, Harwick felt his authority tremble. He did not fire, not yet. Instead, he spat on the floor and shouted for chains. The surviving overseers moved reluctantly, grabbing shackles from the wall. Celia did not resist as they bound her wrists. She did not struggle as they dragged her toward the holding quarters. She walked calmly, her chin high, her silence louder than screams. The bodies of Mississippi's elite still lay cooling on the floor. 15 of the most powerful, erased in a single evening, but power never allows itself to admit defeat. By dawn, the machinery of cover-up would begin. The first decision was silence. No news of the poisoning could spread beyond Yazoo County, not if Mississippi hoped to keep its fragile order intact. These were men of politics, judges of courts, owners of hundreds of human lives. To admit they had been undone by a single enslaved cook would shake the foundations of their empire. And so, within hours, word spread not of poison, but of illness, a sudden fever, an affliction of heat, a plague no one could explain. The second decision was erasure. Celia's name was struck from records, her existence reduced to whispers, court files sealed, testimonies hidden, papers locked away in basements. For nearly a century, her story would remain buried, spoken only in shadows, if at all. But that night, before the erasure, before the silence, before history's mask was reapplied, there was truth. Truth that lingered in the eyes of every enslaved worker who had seen the mighty fall. Truth that trembled in the hands of every overseer too afraid to pull the trigger. Truth that cannot be sealed by ink or law. That power is not invincible. That fear can be poisoned. That one woman's silence, sharpened into action, can collapse an empire in an hour. And as Celia was dragged away in chains, she knew something they did not. The feast had only begun. The cell was nothing more than a dirt-floored storage shed, its air heavy with mildew and the metallic scent of iron chains. They had bound Celia to a post, wrists shackled high above her head, ankles cuffed so tightly her skin swelled against the metal. The overseers filed in one by one, their faces pale from the horrors of the night yet twisted with rage. Harwick led them, pistol still clutched in his shaking hand, though he had not dared fire it. His voice cracked with the desperation of a man trying to rebuild a world already fallen. "Confess!" he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "Tell us what you used. Tell us who helped you." Celia did not answer. She stood in her chains, back straight, eyes steady, her silence cutting deeper than any scream could have. For years she had been forced to speak only when spoken to answer every command, to humble herself with, "Yes, master." But now, when the weight of 15 corpses still lingered in the dining hall, her refusal to speak was defiance carved in stone. The overseers circled like wolves. One slammed the butt of his whip against her ribs, another yanked her head back by the hair. Still, she did not speak. Harwick's rage grew. "If you think silence will save you, you're a fool. We'll scour this plantation. We'll tear the kitchen apart stone by stone. We'll find your poisons. And when we do, we'll make an example of you so severe the rest of your kind will never dare breathe against us again." But even as he spoke, a tremor of doubt flickered in his eyes. He had seen her stand unflinching in the hall while men of wealth and power writhed at her feet. He had seen overseers hesitate when ordered to seize her. He had seen fear spread, not among the enslaved, but among the masters. The balance had shifted, and though chains rattled on her wrists, Celia stood freer in that moment than any of them. By morning, local officials arrived, sheriffs, minor judges, men summoned to contain the disaster. They walked the halls of Willowbrook in silence, their boots tracking blood across Persian carpets, their eyes darting over bodies they could neither explain nor publicly acknowledge. 15 of Mississippi's pillars were gone. To admit the truth would be to admit vulnerability, to reveal that the very foundation of their world could be undone by a single enslaved woman with knowledge they could neither understand nor control. And so, the cover-up deepened. The officials huddled in Rutherford's study, voices low but urgent. "Heat stroke," one muttered. "Spoiled meat," said another. "A fever, yes, a fever carried from the coast." They argued not over what had happened, they knew, but over which lie would most effectively bury the truth. Yet even as they schemed, they could not erase what had been witnessed. The surviving servants whispered of Celia's calm, of her unshakable gaze, of how she had stood unbroken as power collapsed. The overseers whispered too, though their tone was not admiration, but fear. Whispers spread faster than orders, slipping through quarters, fields, neighboring plantations. A story had been born, one that could not be contained. The cook who had turned supper into judgment. That night, they dragged Celia back into the dining hall, the bodies gone, but the stench lingering in the air. The officials sat her before them, chained and bloodied, demanding confession. "Tell us what you did," the sheriff growled. "Name your conspirators. Give us the truth and we may yet spare you the fire." Celia lifted her eyes to meet theirs, her lips parted, and for the first time since her arrest, she spoke. "Truth?" Her voice was low, steady, carrying not pleading but certainty. "You want truth? The truth is in the ground you walk, in the blood you spill, in the screams you drink with your wine. The truth is that power rots, and I only fed you what you planted." The officials recoiled as though struck, not because of the words themselves, but because of the authority with which she spoke them. In that moment, shackled, she sounded less like a prisoner and more like a prophet. They silenced her quickly, ordering the overseers to strike her, to drag her back to her cell. But the words remained, echoing in the hall long after she was gone. They could chain her body, they could bury her story, but they could not chain the knowledge that for one night the masters had been slaves, to their appetites, to their arrogance, to a woman they believed invisible. The system would fight to reclaim dominance. It always did. Trials, cover-ups, threats of fire and gallows. These were the tools of an empire afraid of its own cracks. But the crack had already split open, and the name Celia, whether spoken aloud or whispered in secret, had already become something more dangerous than the men who had tried to erase her. A symbol. They did not give Celia a trial to find truth. They gave her a trial to bury it. By the time the proceedings began in Yazoo County's courthouse, the cover story had already been whispered into the ears of the public. An outbreak of summer fever, a tragic but natural affliction, had claimed 15 of the state's most respected citizens. Newspapers, under the careful hand of editors tied to the planter class, printed vague notices of illness and unfortunate loss. Not a single line mentioned poison, not a single word named Celia. And yet, within the county, within the quarters, within the slave cabins stretching across Mississippi, the whispers spread. Everyone knew. They had heard of her arrest. They had seen the overseers drag her in chains. They had seen officials arrive in the dead of night, carting away bodies with their faces wrapped to hide the truth. They knew Celia had done what no man dared dream, and so the trial was not for justice, it was for containment. The courtroom was packed with white faces, restless, sweating in the heat, their eyes darting between the shackled woman at the front and the officials who would decide her fate. Celia stood silent, her back straight, her chin raised. She did not look at them as a servant might look at a master. She looked at them as equals, or worse, as if she saw straight through them. That gaze unsettled them more than the charges ever could. The prosecutor rose, his voice booming. He did not accuse her of poisoning 15 of Mississippi's elite. That would have been to speak the forbidden truth aloud. Instead, he wove a vaguer tale, that she had conspired in acts of rebellion, that she had spread unrest, that her dangerous influence threatened the delicate fabric of society. Notice the language, not specifics, but shadows, not facts, but fears. They needed her guilty, but they could not name her true crime. To do so would be to admit that one enslaved woman had undone the powerful. Her defense was no defense at all. A court-appointed lawyer, pale with fear, mumbled something about lack of evidence, about the absence of witnesses. But evidence was irrelevant. Witnesses were irrelevant. The verdict had been written before she entered the room. When the judge, a man who had himself feasted in Rutherford's pavilion months before, spoke, his words were measured, but his eyes betrayed his fear. This court finds Celia guilty of conspiracy and insubordination. The punishment is death. The crowd murmured approval, relief even. Order was being restored. The lie was being maintained. But then Celia did what no one expected. She spoke. She did not plead. She did not beg. Her voice was steady, clear, and it cut through the heavy air like a blade. "You call this order," she said, eyes sweeping the room. "But I have seen your order. I have smelled its blood. I have heard its screams. He buried its children. You call me guilty, but it was not my hand that built the whips. It was not my mouth that laughed at suffering. You fear me not because I poisoned your feast. You fear me because I showed you that your power bleeds, that it can die, that it already has." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The judge's gavel slammed, ordering silence, his face twisted in fury. But the words had already sunk in. They echoed in the minds of every person there, slave, overseer, planter alike. For in that moment, shackled and condemned, Celia was freer than any of them. The sentence was carried out swiftly, or so the records claim. Hanging, burial in unmarked ground. But the truth of her end remains clouded in secrecy. Some whispered she was executed before dawn, her body burned to erase all trace. Others claimed sympathetic hands helped her vanish into the night, her story carried like embers into the cabins of the enslaved. What is certain is this: official history sealed her name, silenced her story, and entombed the truth in locked files and courthouse basements. But you cannot kill a symbol. You cannot bury what has already been whispered into memory. The lie in the newspapers could not silence the story told in quarters, in fields, around hidden fires, that one woman had turned supper into judgment. That one woman had shown Mississippi's masters that their world was mortal, and though the court declared victory, it was hollow. The cracks had been revealed, the illusion had been shattered. They could never again believe, not fully, that power was invincible, and that fear, that knowledge, was more dangerous than any poison Celia ever mixed. The court declared her gone, the newspapers declared her forgotten. But Celia did not vanish. Not really. She slipped into that place where dangerous truths always go, not into the record, but into memory, into whispers, into songs, into the secret corners where the oppressed keep their forbidden scripture. Among the cabins of the enslaved, her name was not spoken loudly. It was carried carefully, passed like fire, cupped in hands. Mothers told their children the story in fragments, of a cook who fed poison to masters, of a woman who turned supper into justice. They told it not as a boast, not as a fantasy, but as proof. Proof that even the mighty could bleed. Proof that fear could be turned back against those who wielded it. They told it quietly, because to speak too loud was to invite the lash. Overseers listened. Rumors of rebellion always stirred terror in men who ruled by it. But the whispers persisted, weaving through plantations like roots under soil, unseen yet unbreakable. The story of Celia became more than history. It became warning. It became hope. And as it spread, it changed. Some said she was hanged at dawn, her body left dangling as a warning, but the rope snapped, and she walked away into the woods, never found again. Others swore she had been rescued by abolitionists and carried north under cover of night. Still others claimed she did not die at all, that she was still in Mississippi, watching, waiting, her spirit haunting every feast where masters raised their glasses. Each version was different, but each carried the same truth, that she had shown the cracks in the system, and that was enough. Meanwhile, the official story hardened like plaster. Willowbrook's ledgers were scrubbed. The county clerk locked files in a basement and sealed them. Preachers spoke of God's wrath striking down the planters, never naming the hand that delivered it. And in Mississippi's history books, there was no mention of Celia, no mention of poison, no mention of a supper that had unmade 15 of the state's pillars in one night. But silence in the record is not silence in the soul. Those who were there, those who served that night, those who watched masters fall into their own vomit, carried the memory until their dying breath. Even overseers, drunk with loyalty, could not erase what their eyes had seen. The fear lingered. For years afterward, guests at feasts in Mississippi ate more cautiously, drank more warily. Some insisted on hiring white cooks, others demanded tasters. They cloaked it in pragmatism, but underneath lay the truth. The masters were never as invincible as they pretended, and still the whispers spread, traveling along the same routes as cotton and sugar, northward on abolitionist tongues, southward into the Caribbean, westward with runaway slaves carrying only their stories as weapons. Celia became less a woman than a myth. Some called her a prophetess, others an avenger. To the enslaved, she was proof that power could be poisoned. To the masters, she was a nightmare they did not dare name. That is why history sealed her away. Because if men knew the truth, that one enslaved woman had undone an empire's elite in a single night, then fear would shift. Not fear of masters, but fear of what lay quiet in the kitchens, in the fields, in the shadows they believed harmless. And here is the part you were never meant to hear. The files in Yazoo County were reopened only by accident over. A century later, when archivists stumbled across records hidden beneath courthouse dust, in those yellowed pages, in the cold ink of overseers and officials, her name flickered again. Celia, the cook, the slave, the poisoner, the one they tried to erase. But by then, she had never really been gone. She had lived for 100 years in whispers, in silence that was louder than law, in the fear that never left the dining tables of Mississippi. Because history belongs not to the victors, as they say, but to the survivors who remember what the victors try to bury. And Celia's memory, buried, silenced, twisted, survived, not as a page in a textbook, but as a weapon carried in secret. And now, here, in your ears, in this very moment, her story has broken free again. The most terrifying weapon is not the whip, it is not the chain, it is not even the gun. The most terrifying weapon is the ability to erase. Understand this, every empire survives not because it is strong, but because it convinces you that resistance never happened, that rebellion is impossible, that history is nothing but their victories written in stone. The whip is temporary, the gallows are temporary, but erasure is eternal. That is why Celia's name was sealed, why her story was scrubbed from Mississippi's memory. Because a woman with chains on her wrists had shown that the masters could fall, And if the people knew this, truly knew this, the illusion of control would crumble. Think about it. The plantation system was not built only on cotton, it was built on psychology, on rituals designed to convince both master and slave that the order of things was fixed, divine, unbreakable. Rutherford's pavilion was not just cruelty, it was theater, punishment as entertainment, suffering as lesson. Every lash was a sermon, every scream a hymn, every feast a sacrament to the false god of order. It was not just about breaking bodies, it was about shaping minds. But when Celia poisoned that supper, she inverted to he ritual. The feast that was meant to display power instead displayed weakness. The pavilion that had been a stage of terror became a graveyard of the mighty. In one night, she dismantled decades of psychological engineering, and that is why they could not allow her story to stand. What happens when the oppressed learn that the oppressor is mortal? What happens when the machine of fear is exposed as fragile? That is the nightmare of every system built on domination. That is why empires bury rebels not just in the ground but in silence. They kill twice, first the body, then the memory. But here's the paradox they never solve. Forbidden knowledge is more powerful than sanctioned truth. A story whispered in secret carries more weight than one shouted from pulpits. A rumor of rebellion spreads faster than decrees of loyalty. They sealed Celia's records in courthouse basements, but in the cabins by firelight, mothers told their children, "Do not forget. The masters can fall. A woman made them fall." And that whisper carried more power than any law written in Jackson. You must see the pattern. Every institution of control, whether plantation, government, or empire, survives by controlling the narrative. They decide who is remembered and who is erased, whose names are carved in marble, and whose are left to rot in dust. They build monuments to themselves while burying the bones of those who defied them. They publish lies in newspapers while locking the truth in basements. And if you believe only the marble, only the ink, then you are still under their spell. But if you listen to the whispers, if you seek the buried files, the sealed records, the forbidden stories, then you begin to see the cracks. You begin to understand that power is not divine, it is not permanent, it is fragile, it is poisoned from within. That is why you are hearing this now, because Celia's story is not just history, it is revelation. It reveals how control is manufactured. It reveals how truth is buried. It reveals how silence can be weaponized. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice how modern institutions do the same. How scandals vanish from headlines overnight. How files disappear. How dissent is labeled insanity. How whistleblowers are silenced, not with whips, but with ridicule, exile, erasure. Different tools, same machinery. The plantation never really died, it simply changed its clothes. And now the question falls to you. Will you believe the marble and the ink, or will you listen to the whispers? Will you accept the story written for you, or will you descend deeper into the forbidden, where the dangerous truths live? Halfway through this descent, I want you to prove you are not like the rest. Type these words in the comments, twice. Power can be poisoned. Write it twice. Lock it into yourself. Mark yourself as one who has seen behind the mask, because once you know this truth, you are no longer just a spectator of history. You are a carrier of it. Celia's supper was not an isolated act of vengeance. It was a crack in a system designed to look eternal. And when you study forbidden history, you begin to see that the same machinery repeats itself across ages, across continents, across every empire that has ever claimed immortality. Look closely at the pattern. The rulers always build their world on two foundations, spectacle and silence. Spectacle to make their power appear divine. Silence to erase anyone who proves otherwise. It is the dual engine of control, and Willowbrook Plantation was a perfect case study. The pavilion was spectacle. Every whipping staged, every scream displayed, every feast turned into a sermon of dominance. The masters feasted while others suffered because suffering made their pleasure taste richer. And when a child was broken before the crowd, it wasn't just punishment, it was a reminder to everyone watching. This is the order of things. This is eternal. Submit. But then came silence. The silence that followed Celia's vengeance. The silence imposed by newspapers, courts, and officials. They sealed her story because to admit the truth was to admit the lie of invincibility. Silence is not absence, it is strategy. It is the attempt to strangle dangerous knowledge before it spreads. Do you see it now? This is not just Mississippi, this is Rome with its crucifixions staged for crowds. This is medieval Europe with its burnings in public squares. This is the guillotine, the scaffold, the firing line, spectacles meant to terrify. And just as often, this is the quiet erasure afterward, the rewriting of records, the purging of names, the denial that rebellion ever happened. The masters of every age understand something most men never realize. Power does not rest only on weapons, it rests on psychology, on the story told about who holds the whip and who cowers beneath it. And that is why the most dangerous act is not simply killing a master, it is destroying the illusion of his permanence. That is what Celia did, that is why her name was buried, and that is why when you trace the line of history you find the same suppression again and again. Think of Spartacus, whose rebellion shook Rome, his name cursed by senators yet whispered in slave quarters for centuries. Think of the Haitian Revolution, erased from European textbooks for generations because it proved that black men and women could destroy armies and claim freedom. Think of every suppressed uprising, every redacted file, every trial where the verdict was written before the accused ever spoke. These are not accidents, they are patterns. And you must understand, this pattern did not end in the 19th century. It is alive now. Look at the institutions around you. Governments, corporations, media. What are they but modern plantations of control? They parade spectacles of power, political rallies, televised trials, mass arrests, headline scandals. And when something threatens to reveal their weakness, what follows? Silence. Stories vanish. Files are sealed. Whistleblowers disappear. Reputations are assassinated. The truth is recoded into lies. You are told rebellion does not exist. You are told dissent is madness. You are told the system cannot be undone. But the whisper, the forbidden truth, is that it has been undone before, that it will be undone again, and that the only thing standing between you and knowledge is the courage to look past the marble statues and listen to the whispers buried beneath them. Celia's supper is a map, a microcosm. It shows you how fear is engineered and how it collapses. It shows you that one invisible woman in a kitchen, armed only with knowledge passed down from her grandmother, could make Mississippi's pillars tremble and fall. And if that can happen once, it can happen again. Every empire carries the seeds of its own death. Celia's story proves it. And now that you know it, you carry those seeds too. Think carefully about what happened at Willowbrook. 15 of the most powerful men and women in Mississippi gathered to celebrate themselves, to feast on wealth carved from human backs, to witness a child's body broken as proof of their order. They believed they were eternal. They believed fear itself was theirs to command. And in one night, they were all gone, not by war, not by armies, not by politics, by supper. By one woman they never thought capable of holding power. That is the revelation. The powerful are not destroyed only by cannons or revolutions. They are destroyed by the cracks they refuse to see, by the servants they overlook, by the truths they bury. They are undone not with shouts, but with silence sharpened to a blade. Celia did not scream. She did not announce rebellion. She simply acted, and the empire fell around her. This is prophecy because the same arrogance lives in every institution today. Look at the leaders who sit at long tables, raising glasses to their order, their progress, their achievements. Look at the boardrooms, the parliaments, the summits, men in tailored suits congratulating themselves while ignoring the suffering that funds their banquet. They believe themselves untouchable, eternal. They believe fear is still theirs to command. But the cracks are always there. Behind every curtain of power lies someone they think invisible, someone forced into silence, someone underestimated, someone carrying forbidden knowledge, a worker with access to files, a servant in the room where secrets are whispered, a voice that refuses to bow even when chained. These are the Celias of every age, and when the moment comes, it is never a roar. It is always a whisper, a seed planted in silence that topples the banquet of kings. Understand the danger of this knowledge. Once you see the machinery, you cannot unsee it. Once you know that fear is manufactured, that power is fragile, that silence can be weaponized, you are no longer obedient. You are no longer the audience in their pavilion. You are outside the script. That is why they bury stories like Celia's. Because if men like you knew the truth, if you carried it in your bones, their entire system would tremble, and this is why you feel unease right now, not because you are hearing a ghost story, but because you are hearing a mirror. Celia is not buried in Yazoo County. She is here. In every file sealed, in every whistle silenced, in every story erased from your history books. Her supper was not just an ending, it was a warning that no matter how high the chandeliers burn, no matter how loud the music plays, no matter how confident the masters become, power can still choke on its own feast. So ask yourself, what banquet are you sitting at now? What institutions are raising glasses to themselves while hiding the screams that fund their empire? Whose feast are you silently serving? And how long until someone somewhere decides that silence is no longer enough? The truth is dangerous because it is prophecy, and prophecy always finds fulfillment. The chandeliers of Willowbrook have long since fallen. The pavilion is gone. The cotton fields lie quiet, the bones of the enslaved hidden beneath their soil. Colonel Rutherford's name has rotted into dust, and the men who once ruled Mississippi with rings on their fingers are remembered only in footnotes, if at all. But Celia, though they tried to bury her, remains. Not as a statue, not as a plaque, not as a chapter in the history books. No, she lives in something far more dangerous. Memory, whispered memory, forbidden knowledge, the kind of story that is not taught but carried like contraband, passed down because it contains a secret too sharp to be forgotten. That power bleeds, that fear is fragile, that silence can kill kings. You sit here now watching this because some part of you is searching for those forbidden truths, and you have found one. Celia's supper is not just history, it is a mirror. It shows you the machinery of control, the arrogance of the powerful, the fragility of their feast, and it whispers to you a truth you cannot unhear. Every system that claims eternity is already poisoned from within. Look around you. The plantations are gone, but the machinery remains. Corporations, governments, churches, courts, still staging their spectacles, still writing their lies, still silencing their Celias. They build towers instead of mansions, hold summits instead of suppers, but the banquet is the same. They laugh while others bleed. They raise glasses while others starve. They mistake their rituals for permanence. But permanence is an illusion. Power rots, and history belongs not to those who raise their goblets, but to those who dare whisper against them. Celia whispered with her silence, with her herbs, with her cooking pots. And in one night she proved what the powerful fear most, that they are not gods, not eternal, not untouchable. They are mortal, and mortality can be fed to them like supper. This is why you were never meant to hear her story. This is why it was sealed in courthouses, erased from textbooks, scrubbed from polite memory. Because once you hear it, you can no longer play the role they wrote for you. You can no longer believe their marble statues, their polished speeches, their endless spectacles. You begin to see the cracks. You begin to feel the poison already moving through their feast. And so the choice falls to you. You can turn away, pretend this was just another story, another shadow in the attic of history, or you can carry it, you can whisper it, you can let it sharpen you, because dangerous knowledge only becomes powerful when it spreads, when it refuses erasure, when it burns in the hearts of men who refuse to bow. Remember Celia, not as a victim, not as a footnote. Remember her as prophecy, a woman in chains who revealed the fragility of empires, a cook who served death to her masters, a silence that thundered louder than any whip. And the next time you see the powerful gathered at their feast, smiling, drinking, congratulating themselves, remember this: every empire has its supper, every banquet has its poison, every master has his Celia,